From the Boston Globe and PRX, this is Love Letters. I'm Meredith Goldstein. So I usually don't talk politics here. I mean, I do because everything is politics. The ability to love who you want is politics. The freedom to get good health care for a loved one is politics. Our recent episode about a refugee finding work, love, safety, and happiness in Rhode Island, that's all politics. I changed my mind, actually. We are a political show. But we're not an election show, if that makes sense. It feels like we've been in an ongoing election for like 12 years, if that's possible. It's exhausting. So I always hope that Love Letters can be an oasis, an escape from talking about swing states and the trials of former presidents. And I want to remain that kind of place for escape. But reality is what it is. And a few months ago, I got a letter that felt very 2016 coded. The headline was, 3 dates with a Trump supporter. I'm going to have our new producer, Christine, read the letter for dramatic effect.
Dear Meredith, I'm hoping to get your advice on a tricky situation in today's climate. I've gone on 3 dates with a man. We had one of the best first dates I've been on in a really long time, and I've been dating for a while. I've tried it all. Apps, blind dates, speed dating, friend setups, coworkers. So I don't want to throw away potential chemistry, given how hard it is to find someone these days. However, it recently came to my attention that this man is a Trump supporter. As a Democrat, and to be honest, more importantly, as a citizen of the world, I can't understand with all that we now know how you can still support this man. I won't get into all of my views, but I'm truly curious if a dating relationship could work if your underlying political beliefs are so opposed. Can you actually have healthy conversations around that? Can you respect the other person's opinions, even if they're not reflected in your own? And can you have a fulfilling relationship with someone? Is all fair in love and politics?
Thank you, Christine, for giving voice to that letter writer. Beautifully done. So, can you guess how I answered this one? Well, I'll tell you. Letter writer, you ask, can you actually have healthy conversations around that? Can you respect the other person's opinions, even if they are not reflected in your own? And can you have a fulfilling relationship with someone? Well, sure, letter writer, in theory. But 4 and 8 years ago, I read a lot of letters from people in long marriages who were trying to make it work, even though they'd lost respect for their partners, even though they felt unseen by their partners. Those letter writers were usually people who had a decade or more of love and good memories to lean on. Still, they were struggling. In your case, letter writer, it's so new, and we're heading into an election. Do you want to have these conversations frequently? Do you want to be in a relationship with someone who wants a certain kind of world? One you don't like? My advice is to ask him what you asked me. How can you still support this man? If you're satisfied with his answer, great. If he asks you why you don't support Trump and really wants to listen and hear you out, wonderful, I guess. If you don't like the answer, move on. And I suspect you will not like it. Honestly, this whole letter is more about dating fatigue than anything else. You're not feeling chemistry with most people. Maybe that means you need to give people a date 4 instead of just 3. I'd rather have a slow burn with someone than great energy but no shared values. You don't have to lower your bar for company just because dating is difficult. Making do with what you found isn't a great way to add something wonderful to your life. Signed, Meredith. For the record, I do think this letter had a lot more to do with dating fatigue than the letter writer knew. Sometimes we get so tired of searching and going on first dates that we start to ignore red flags. And that's when we need to take a break. Also, commenters who left notes under the letter thought I was way too both-sidesy about the situation. One commenter said, "Run away from a Trump supporter. Delusions creep into other aspects of one's life like a virus." Another commenter said, "As a professional woman, I could not date someone who denigrates women." A more middle-of-the-road person said, "My wife was a very progressive liberal. I'm a veteran, but unenrolled voter. We simply did not discuss politics very often. We did occasionally discuss current events, but were cognizant of each other's point of view and never tried to change each other's philosophy. We are all different. Are you looking for the perfect person?" For the record, as a columnist, I kept an open mind with this letter writer as much as possible, because of course I understand why this should be a deal breaker, but it wasn't for the letter writer just yet. So maybe she's not so opposed to the situation, and I have to make space for that. During this election season, I do want to hear questions and get letters and voicemails from people who are navigating complicated political questions in their relationships. I am particularly interested in conversations we're having about Gaza, because I'm fascinated by the way couples, friends, and in-laws have thought they've been aligned by political parties and social values forever, but are suddenly realizing they feel very differently about the same thing. Now they have to figure out how to talk about it and learn from each other. Anyway, my point is, feel free to write to the column with relationship questions about anything, but that includes political questions. Yes, the regular stories and letters about breakups and starting over and finding love and flirting are my favorite, but the world is political. Maybe we can navigate some of this together, while still being a happy oasis. I promise we'll take lots of breaks. Because I can't deal with thinking about these elections all the time, or I will lose it. And on that note, today I bring you a crossover we did with a very popular podcast, Pantsuit Politics. It's a show that aims to, in their words, prioritize curiosity over the conflict that often drives political conversations. Hosts Sarah Stewart Holland and Beth Silvers do their best to let people talk about uncomfortable things in a comfortable way, and it's not always easy. They wanted to ask me a bunch of questions about politics and relationships, and I did my best to answer. Their show features really big guests talking about everything from certain trial verdicts to WNBA pay equity to Taylor Swift's life under the spotlight, and I was happy to bring love into their programming. Hear a bit of my interview with Pantsuit Politics when we come back.
Here at Life Kit, NPR's self-help podcast, we love the idea of helping you make meaningful lifestyle changes. Our policy, don't be too punishing on yourself or too grand in your goals, which is why we've got shows on how to help you make little nudges to your behavior and create habits that stick. Join Life Kit to get the tools you need. Listen to the Life Kit podcast from NPR.
Meredith, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We are delighted to talk with you. Tell us a little bit about love letters and specifically about the political love letters that you receive.
So I've been writing the Love Letters advice column for 15 years now. So that's like a really long time. So we get letters about everything from breakups to dating fatigue to divorces to in-laws. And of course, we wind up also getting political letters. And you know, we also have translated this over to a podcast where people tell longer stories about their problems and solutions. And we have mostly shied away from politics on the podcast, preferring to stick with breakups, et cetera. But in the letters and the advice column, it comes up. And, you know, everything is politics a little bit. So what I get when I receive political letters, usually there's a gender divide, meaning that it's not a same-sex couple. Usually it is he likes this and believes this and I believe that. I mean, I hate to generalize, but that's what it's been. And I look back, there was a letter that I think is actually adorable now about a pre-Trump local election, Coakley and Scott Brown for senator. Somebody wrote in and was like, he likes Scott Brown, I like Coakley. And in Massachusetts, like at the time, I was like, oh, this is really difficult. Not long after that, I'd be like, oh, how quaint.
Yeah.
So I got a lot of letters during 2016, and I actually picked them here and there because everybody was feeling it. And now it's different, right? Because we've been with this for a long time. That there was a shock at that time about how could I not know this about my partner that was really complicated.
So more importantly, when you get them, what do you say? What do you tell people who are on different sides of the political spectrum with their partners?
Well, they're all super nuanced. So it's not as simple as if you disagree, that's it, right? Of course not. I think what I've been trying to do over the years is have people look at the micro, small issue level. I was just listening to a talk by historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, and she was talking about, well, most of the people in the country, feel the same way about guns, or most of the people in the country feel the same way about abortion. Like, she was trying to make a crowd of people feel better about what if we never get along. And sometimes with couples, I'm like, well, there are probably a lot of things you do agree about, and it's much more than a sign here and a sign there. I think these conversations have to be super granular, but when there is no middle ground, and there is no respect about the lack of middle ground. Yeah, I kind of say to people, some of you have to break up. Some of you probably should break up, but a lot of you also probably do have a middle ground. And I'm seeing that now with a whole different group of people thinking about Gaza and the Middle East. It's just like, that this is, how do you talk about this in a way that's more than just a sign?
I wonder how you think about political disagreements in relationships versus other types of disagreements. Is there a category difference for you, or does this connect to the kind of fundamental issues that you see when people disagree about how they parent or how they interact with in-laws or other kinds or money, other kinds of disputes that come up in relationships?
It's almost like branding to some extent, right? And I think it depends on what the difference is, right? If you're talking about reproductive rights, this could be just what it is and a deal breaker right off the bat. But when you get into how somebody feels about a candidate and how they make you feel, it can sometimes, I think, seem bigger than it is. Whereas all of our other problems, most of the time, are about, being seen on a daily level, how you're treated. I mean, it's really interesting. You can meet somebody who shares your exact politics and has all the right buttons. And when I say that, I mean like buttons on a backpack, right? Pins. And they can treat you terribly. I remember years ago knowing someone who had a partner who, was volunteering and always worried about the world and talking about green energy before anybody else was. And he was like a pretty terrible boyfriend. So we have to think about our other problems are often, how do you treat me in our home? How are you listening? How do you hear me? How do you see me? Are we having fun? And yet when we get into politics, it absolutely connects with how we behave in our home, but sometimes those things don't match.
I have to believe that got supercharged during COVID. That's what we experienced here. That was the ground zero for my political beliefs match up with my daily behaviors, match up with how I'm interacting with other people. And so it was just fertile ground for so many conflicts in families and churches and workplaces, and I'm sure inside relationships.
We had like a year and a half of so many COVID letters, and we still get them sometimes, but I think some of them were more political than they knew. Most people were like, this rule doesn't work for me. And I wound up talking to a lot of people who were sex therapists about boundaries, because weirdly they were in a similar space, right? About, this makes me feel safe, this doesn't make me feel safe, and we have to share this space together. So you can't have your friend over who goes into grocery stores unmasked, right? And the masking was political. And it also brought up a lot about ableism, I think, for a lot of people, where people who were caregiving and people who were thinking about others were saying, okay, wait, just because we don't have to mask for ourselves, who are we masking for? And to be honest, we were all really led in many different directions about this.
Right.
So I have a lot of empathy for people who are like, we don't know what to do. And I find myself really inconsistent, and I have high risk people in my life, and my COVID rules are my COVID rules, and they will change at any second, and I'll get mad about them with everybody. And I think we all experience that a little bit. So yeah, so many letters from people about, oh, well, my significant other's best friend won't get vaccinated. I don't want them to come over. Yeah, it brought up a lot of issues about consent and sharing space.
I wonder how often we're using politics to work out things underneath the politics. Do you think that when people write to you, it usually is really about the politics, or that it's about something more like respect in the relationship, or just being heard or feeling dismissed?
I think a lot of times for me, I'm hearing about personal issues and feeling dismissed and what are the rules of the home and am I seen? But I think there's this separate thing that happens with politics, which is I brought up the word brand, and I feel gross using it, but there is the branding of a person, right? What do they say they believe versus how do they behave in the world, and how far does it go? I mean, I think about my neighborhood a lot, which I love, and it's a very progressive place that is also deeply gentrified and now unaffordable for a lot of people. And so you have a lot of people around who want to do right by the world and yet like are part of a greater issue in real estate and the movement of cities. And people far smarter than me can talk about this. But, it's like we all have a preference for how we engage with the world and try to make it better in a way that we think makes it better. And our partners do too. It's like, are we comfortable with their priority list? And that's like really difficult because it might have nothing to do with how they treat you when they're home and like watching TV.
Actually, that touches on something that I wonder as an advice writer. We've done advice on and off throughout the podcast, and I always struggle when someone asks us for advice because I think, well, I need to know a million more things about this situation. And you kind of touched on that, like you kind of asked some questions about what's going on. How do you deal with that? How do you feel like, how can I offer good advice to this person when there's so much information I'm missing?
I mean, if I were an actual mental health professional and not a journalist turned advice columnist, I would not be telling people what to do. That's not how it works, right? So a lot of the time I'm just like, you know what would be good, taking another step and finding an actual mental health professional. But what I found is that like, when the act of writing a letter is really helpful. You get it down on paper, you prioritize the information. Someone can send me a letter saying, here are all the reasons this is not going to work politically with my partner, but also like they're really sweet. Or they can give me 800 words about how sweet they are and one line about the politics, right? And they're telling their own story. They're prioritizing their own, information there. So some of it is I can make an educated guess based on what they've chosen to share. The other thing is that sometimes I'm just straight up wrong. And the good news about that is that people will email me and say, like, you told me this, and it made it clear that it was really that. So, I always say, like, listen, this is your life. Like, figure it out on your own. I don't know all the information, but sometimes I'll say, it sounds like it's the end of your relationship. And somebody will write back and say, you know what, it turned out it wasn't. And hearing that from you clarified what I hadn't shared. So I think sometimes it's helpful to be wrong. And I love it when I'm wrong in a way that means somebody else gets to be more happy.
I'm stuck on your use of the word brand about politics. So I want to dig into that a little bit more and ask you how often you feel like you're hearing, I am personally uncomfortable with where my spouse is, or something more like, I'm worried about how other people will perceive us because of this difference. I'm embarrassed about where my spouse is.
Yeah. And it's also the language, right? Like we got to make sure we're also saying the phrases that claim we are what we want to be. So I think it's a little of both. I think it is about embarrassment. And then it's also about betrayal. I think I thought you understood my role in the world as a woman, and now you're telling me you don't because you support this candidate or you don't support this issue. I thought you saw me and now I'm not thinking you do. So I do think it's both. I think it's, please don't embarrass me at a party. Please don't show people that you don't get it. But then it's also, wait, do you understand my experience in the world?
I think the hardest thing about that, as I listen to it, is that I find my marriage to be a really useful place not to debate the politics of something, but to figure out what I know and don't know and what's important to me. I feel like I have more freedom in my relationship to change my mind than I do maybe elsewhere in the world. I wonder if that dynamic is unusual for me or if you think that exists for, in many relationships.
I think it depends on the partnership, but I do think there is this like behind closed doors, wait, I don't really get that. Can we look into that together? Or like, can you tell me your experience? I mean, I think it's, I have a significant other who is like, a nice man who is a white dude who, is like really comfortable asking questions. And actually, when everything started months ago with things happening in the Middle East, he was like, so you're Jewish, right? And I was like, yeah. And then it's like having a conversation. Well, here's what I know. Here's what I don't know. And I was like, here's what I don't know, which is a lot, right? And this assumption that everybody knows the things that they know, right? But it felt safe to have a conversation, because the first thing we admitted was all that we don't know. And in some relationships that's not going to happen, and others it will, about one thing. And I have to get better about not jumping into the you're doing it wrong space, which I think falls to like my assumptions about gender a little bit. But it's all political, right? You know, he's watching the Criterion Collection's top 100 films or something like that. And I was like, I bet all the critics are male. I bet they don't, how many women directors, right? And like, maybe I'm right. I don't even know. But the point is, I don't know if I'm right. And I don't know yet. And I'm already ticked off. So it's figuring that out too. Like, I don't know, like, let's take a look at the list. Let's see what might be absent and why.
Well, and it just occurs to me that politics is often the manifestation of whether or not you are assuming you already know everything about your partner, or if it's an entry point into learning more about your partner, and distinguishing whether someone decides that they already know everything they need to know about you, or that you are something they're always interested in learning more about, is really about the relationship, not about politics, which is true in a lot of things we talk. I mean, we've said that before about all political conversations, that they should be an entry point and a place of curiosity instead of a way to judge or conclude things about each other. But I applaud you. I think doing advice is tough. I struggle with it every time it comes up on our podcast, and especially any relationship questions, but relationship questions that involve politics, I think are even more intense. So thanks for helping people and listening to people. I think you're right. I love your insight that sometimes getting it wrong is the most helpful thing you can do for someone.
Thanks so much to Pantsuit Politics for letting me join. And a reminder for Love Letters friends, we're still looking for stories for next season. Have you had an out-of-the-box experience in your relationship life? Learned a lesson in a weird way? Had an unforgettable breakup and recovery from that breakup? Navigated a relationship by doing something unexpected? You know what we like here. Send us your story. You can also send us a question for the column. As I mentioned, we love those too. The email is loveletters@boston.com. The phone number for voicemails is 401-484-0590. That's 401-484-0590. Love Letters is a production of the Boston Globe and PRX. Today's episode was produced by Christine Ahanachu. Ned Porter does our audio mixing, sound design, and mastering. Maddie Mortel does our audience engagement. Special thanks to Linda Henry. Kristen Nelson is our head of audio. Nancy Barnes is the Globe's editor. Our music is from APM. Find episode transcripts and more Love Letters content at loveletters.show. Now enjoy the rest of the day. Think about something light and easy. I'm going to try to do that too. I'm Meredith Goldstein. Thanks for listening.